Okay, now, so I just to repeat, Tom rather kind of twisted my arm and said this was the paper I should give on tragedy. And it's a paper I've wanted to give for about 20 years. But it's something that I've avoided because it's not as much about Herodotus as it is about the Antigone and about tragedy's relationship to its contemporary political climate. And I don't mean the kind of vague kind of relationship to democratic ideology, which we all know about, but actual political events and their reception by contemporaries. And how Attic tragedy and of course also comedy kind of figure as some kind of intervention in the political discourse around these events and debates. Now, why have I been avoiding this? Well, because such readings of tragedy are usually frowned upon. I mean, they're considered reductive, German, of the old days. And so if you're not going to commit to the really long slog of demonstrating just how much such a reading explains and how rather than reductive, it's actually enriching, it's really a thankless task. And for me, there's always been other things to write about, other fish to fry, such as dating Herodotus, or which also took a long time to get sort of to work my way through. Now, whatever, to my mind, or however I could say it otherwise, unfortunately, I believe that what tragedy is doing in its contemporary context really strikes at the heart of why and how Herodotus deploys the genre of tragedy in his work, and the relationship that his allusions or his intertextuality with tragedy sort of strikes with his audiences. So this is really the core of, I think, you have to understand what tragedy was doing in Athens to understand what Herodotus is doing with tragedy, I think, or at least that's what I believe. And that's really in the paper I wanted to deliver today, largely because I had written it up already in July and it would have been quite easy to do. It's going to appear in a volume for Andreas Schwab and Alexander Schütze on Herodotus's Cambyses Logos. But so tonight I'm just going to beard this lion in its den with the sort of warning that I'm not a tragedy scholar, and this is a passage that kind of defeats people, but still I think there's something I might have to say. Now, we all know the offending passage, Antigone's defense of her choice to honor her brother with burial given the cost to herself, and her rather counterintuitive and counterfactual claim that only for a brother, not any hypothetical husband nor child, would she have gone to these lengths. So the problem, was most eloquently and authoritatively expressed by Goethe, who wished some good and capable philologists would prove the passage unauthentic and excise it. It's primarily the inconsistency of this claim with things she said earlier, that only for her brother would she have so acted. Earlier, she expresses principles, a commitment to unwritten nomima that that sort of would eschew such reckoning about whether the dead were replaceable or not, as to whether one would act. This is what Goethe called a dialectical calculus bordering on the comic, disturbing to the tragic mood, and he found it generally labored. My purpose in citing his criticisms is not really to name drop, though it's quite a great passage, but to acknowledge that the criticisms are in a way accurate, or at least they're valid as far as reception is concerned. Many people have been struck this way by it, even without reading their Goethe. And as such, it has to be part of any interpretation of the passage and any identification of what actually lies behind it. And it's worth noting that the excision that Goethe's sort of grounds for excision are based largely on aesthetic grounds, nach meinem Gefühl, and he doesn't seem particularly committed to the idea that a worthy philologist would succeed. It's just his wish. Now, there are very powerful discussions defending the passage in literary and thematic terms, and I've really enjoyed reading them. Murnahan's passage, Bridget's article, and Neuberg in 1990 and Kropp in 1997. Philologically, there's nothing particularly wrong with the passage. It's actually an excellent kind of piece of drama. And had someone the likes of Goethe not thrown down the gauntlet and Herodotus not offered some kind of fix, I'm not quite sure anyone would be keen on excising this passage. But we'd still have to explain it. And this is what I hope I'm gonna do. So in what follows, I'm going to argue first that the argument of Sophocles Antigone is not alluding to Herodotus, but second, that it does allude to something external to the play. Third, that Herodotus alludes to both that same something and to Sophocles' Antigone because of their shared referent. And that behind both texts is Athens' crushing of Samos in 439 BC and the transformation of Athens' behavior towards her allies into something depicted as equivalent to Persian imperialism. And finally, 5, that what the famous passage of the Antigone responds to is Pericles' funeral oration over the Samian War dead. And Herodotus alludes to Sophocles' passage because his logoi of Book 3 engage with the same historical event as that tragedy, but uses the distancing technique of Persian history in place of tragedy's use of myth. So that's the paper. So first, and this is handout 2, is about whether Herodotus provides any explanation for this passage. The behavior of Intaphernes' wife elicits Thoma in her intradiegetic audience, Darius. Why, he wonders, would she sacrifice so much for her brother? Both Darius and Herodotus's audiences require an explanation, and with the Persian king, readers will pass, and along with the Persian king, readers will pass judgment on what they hear. This is no different from Antigone's audiences, both the chorus and the play's audience, amongst whom are those thinking correctly, whom she is aiming to persuade, and perhaps as well to flatter. There is intertextuality, certainly, but no obligation to understand straightforward allusion in either direction, let alone Sophocles to Herodotus, given the powerful evidence that would argue for the opposite. And this is handout 3. The performance of Sophocles' Antigone is pretty firmly correlated by ancient testimony with the Samian War that broke out in 440 BC in response to the Athenians' imposition of democracy there, and a war which finished in 439 BC after a 9-month siege, costing the Athenians somewhere between 1,200 to 1,400 talents, expenses they passed on as indemnity to the Samians. The Antigone has been associated with that war, so we get in handout 3A. It was supposedly the esteem in which Sophocles was held after the production of Antigone that led to his election as general in Samos, according to Aristophanes of Byzantium. And the Vita dates that his generalship to the war against the Aenians, that generalship in the war against the Aenians to 7 years before the Peloponnesian War. Now, with Lewis in 1988, not the famous David Lewis, but someone with an initial R, I date the play to 438 BC, understanding that after the tempestuous years culminating in the defeat of the Samians, and with hostile Aenians on the mainland, who in fact will vex the Athenians for decades, some Athenian military presence was still required in the region, and Sophocles, especially after this play, was a useful his appointment as general was a useful diplomatic move. So then I'll turn to Samos. As for the date of, I'll return to Samos in a moment, but as for the date of Herodotus' histories, and this is 3B on the handout, we all know the earliest terminus postquem of our extant text is found in the story of Talthybius's wrath and its allusion to the Athenians' murder of Spartan ambassadors in the summer of 430 BC. An event recounted also by Thucydides 267. I, of course, put the text much later than that, but I don't need to argue that here. Given the evidence, it seems perverse to deny that if one author should be felt to allude to the other, Herodotus should be the culprit. And one might add here an argument from likelihood. So that's handout 3C. The genre of tragedy, with its definitive performance context of thousands of viewers at a much talked about event, would be a better known referent for allusion by a prose writer than the performance of a prose text by the performance of a prose text by a tragedy. One would have to explain why Sophocles would want to make such an allusion to something more obscure, whereas no contorted explanation is needed for Herodotus to be alluding to a famous tragedy, particularly if it was subject to reperformance in the decade or decades that followed, and possibly even available as a written text, which is something that Pat Easterling and Bernard Knox sort of speak about in the Cambridge History of Greek Literature, that possibly text circulated for sale around the time of tragic performances. But whatever the case is, if you had to guess a direction, not knowing the passages, but just knowing one the genres, it makes more sense that Herodotus be alluding to tragedy. Now, to defend in the face of the evidence the idea of an alluding Sophocles, arguments are therefore needed. And this is handout 4. Oral performances are wheeled out. This is for A. I won't go into all the Eusebius and all these other guys. The evidence is pretty weak, but it's certainly plausible that some proto version of the histories could have been performed or circulated in Athens, not least if Sophocles and Herodotus enjoyed some friendship, as the epigram alleged to have been written by the poet to Herodotus, and the thematic and intellectual affinities between their works might suggest. But even if a performance or performances did happen, those in the audience who would recognize allusion to them would constitute an exceptionally elite body of viewers. And then if one argues that whether others recognized it as Herodotus was irrelevant to Sophocles, then you also have to sort of say, well, why did he make it so jarring? Was it so that they could recognize the fact of an allusion without knowing the source? And if that's the case, the source could be anything. It doesn't have to be Herodotus. So I'm sort of not sure why we want to go down that path. The other solution is to say it's interpolation from Herodotus, and that's 4b on the handout. And we can, of course, go that way, but we have to acknowledge that Aristotle was in no doubt that the author was Sophocles, which could, however, allow the possibility of interpolation by the author for a later performance. But whether Sophocles or someone else, those who hold the view would have to explain why it would have been done and also acknowledge its quality. To what end would Sophocles or anyone else have bothered to make this kind of allusion to Herodotus? And why make it as conspicuous as some scholars have held it to be when they believe it's Herodotus as a source? Now, on some levels, one wonders why it needs exceptional explanation beyond the talents of a sensitive reader of the play. And this is handout 5. I really struggle to understand in what way the excellent analyses of the passage and context that Bridget Murnaghan has done, or Neuberg or Kropp, just to name 3 recent-ish people of a passage that's been written on, very thoroughly. None of their discussions actually need Herodotus. They all show in various excellent ways that the passage works in the play. And the thing is, Antigone herself marks her own words as uttered to a particular audience. She says, "Tois phronusi or tois phronusi," to those who are thinking, this is my argument. So she's kind of flagged that it's going to be not to everyone's cup of tea, or it's going to be of a certain register. So one would do well to ask who these people are and why so named, which is something to which I'll return. Moreover, Antigone's clever but off-kilter justification of her act is not qualitatively different to my mind than her comments earlier that she was going to die anyway. I mean, she sort of says, well, why wouldn't I do this? I knew I was going to die. So there's not any reason to not to act as she's done. That kind of passage where she sort of says because she's going to die, she might as well die this way. I mean, it can be as off-putting as how we feel about Xenophon's apology when it says that Socrates sort of spoke the way he did because he was old and he thought, let me die before I get ill. I mean, it's something that rubs us up the wrong way because we want the grand principle when this seems to take it down to something more banal or calculating. Anyway, so it's not that much at odds. I mean, with some of the other passage, which sort of seems to put a kind of calculus in that maybe we wish it didn't. And it does seem quite at home. Why do we need to kind of look outside Sophocles either? Because, it seems quite at home with what her father says in the Oedipus Tyrannos when he proves or tries to prove to the chorus that this was a good idea to blind himself. This is handout 5b. When the chorus doubt his judgment, he argues on the contrary that the best thing he could do to avoid the sight of his parents in Hades was to do this. So these kind of answers or replies or proving the kind of almost the weaker argument, the stronger, or sort of something that's unexpected is a feature that we have in Sophoclean tragedy. And certainly it's in some of Herodotus's most tragic passages that he has similar jarring justifications of behavior that seems uncustomary at first sight, requiring some kind of explanation for the perplexed audience. And this is 5c, where I refer to Croesus's utterance of Solon as he's about to be consumed in flames, or Saminetus's failure to bewail the fate of his own children, but instead that of an old drinking buddy who's been reduced to beggary. This perplexes the viewer, who happens to be the leader of an arcade, and he seeks answers and then finds the answers to his satisfaction. And so the thing is, it seems to be a tragic thing to do, and it seems to be a thing that Herodotus does when he's being tragic. I would also say that if Sophocles' passage is considered by some a problem, Herodotus' passage is just as big a problem, or not a problem at all, depending how you want to look at it. If you look at 5d, I mean, the interjection of this story, this Intaphernes' wife story, is pretty artificial itself. It's wedged between the tribute passage, the last word of which is phoros, and then an abrupt analepsis to Samos during Cambyses' lifetime in 3120. So we just get like this little touch base in on when we last left our conspirators, this is what's happened since, and then we jump out of it again. So it itself is an interjection, and just as awkward, particularly as we have kind of a return to an earlier point in the historical narrative, with Cambyses still alive. So that gets to the issue of, like, if we want to keep the notion of an illusion, how would we understand it in each direction? And that's 6a on the handout. Stephanie West, in an extremely rich article with loads of nuanced observations that I'm very fond of, sort of sees in the Antigone a Persian plot that Sophocles paints Creon with all the excesses at home in Persian monarchy, as one finds in Herodotus. Now, this is an observation about Creon's behavior with which I happen to agree, but I don't see why Cambyses is needed as Creon's model. An Athenian playwright doesn't have to go to Herodotus to find such characterizations of Persian monarchy. They're ubiquitous. So I don't see that Herodotus is needed here. If we flip the direction and we look the other way, 6b on the handout, what we would have would be a Herodotus depicting his Persians in ways that are evocative all too much of Greeks and Athenians and of tragedy. Now, in terms of weight, I find this latter scenario inherently more supported by the evidence. The constitutional debate of Book 3, or Darius's speech that initiates the coup, where he says that lying and telling the truth are practically the same thing because we do them for profit. This suggests Greeks and Greeks of the sophistic age, particularly the Athenians. This suggests them more than Antigone and Creon suggests Persia or evoke Persia. One reference to Indian gold does not offset all that, as far as I'm concerned. I will, however, become the proponent of a further theoretical possibility that West has yet to come across, as she says, that of a common source, and that's 6c on the handout. I think both poet and historian are alluding to what the Athenians had become in the late 450s and 440s. The audience of the Antigone, which at the Dionysia would have included the allies, would have needed no allusion to Herodotus to understand what was behind a strategos, as Creon is called in line 8, displaying tyrannical behaviors that could be seen to evoke stereotypes of Persian arche. It was all around them, particularly after the movement of the Delian treasury to Athens. But before going there, I would just say a word about Herodotus Book 3, and that's handout 7. Its tragic allusions and about its Athenian Persians. It's a book teeming with tragic vignettes, and this is 7a, from Saminetus, who watches his own daughter among a virtual chorus of girls called Hydrophoroi, which is a good tragic title, processing across an imperial stage, he himself evoking pity from Cambyses, to Cambyses' own demise when he bewails, as Herodotus actually says, he bewails his entire praxis. I mean, it's even the language of tragedy. Finglas has written on the tragic elements of the Periander Logos, And in this venue, Charles Chason and Bridget Murnaghan have elaborated on the tragic elements of this logos. And more could be written, I think, about Polycrates and his death, said to be unworthy of his megalophrosyne, a tragic peripeteia of the classic Aristotelian sort. An allusion to Antigone in such a context would certainly not go amiss. No siree. But other elements of Book 3 also suggest that Herodotus is evoking more of contemporary Athens than its famous literary genre. In 7b on the handout, we have not only as Darius, the consummate sophist, who would find himself quite at home at Athens, but in 7c, Herodotus's Persians of Book 3 contemplate democracy, which is disturbed some, in 380, and they collect phoros, which is, of course, the word that was coined for the Delian League contribution instead of dasmos. Moreover, the mad Cambyses is depicted in such a way to allude to mad men in possession of arche much closer to home, and that's 7d on the handout. Madness was a topos associated with Athens' imperial democracy. This is something that I wrote up this summer for Andreas Schwab and Alexander Schutze, but some suggestion of the article lies in my article of 2014 on the Ethiopian Logos. Moreover, the Persian imperial campaigns and ambitions of Book 3, this is 7e and f on the handout, Egypt and Samos particularly, but also Carthage in the West, are described in such ways as to evoke those of their Athenian counterparts. And in the case of Egypt, there are 3 references to the Athenians' later activity there at 312, 315, and 3160, the last chapter of the book. And these are things I've written about. Now, in this context, Samos is crucial. This is handout 8. The island's presence and affairs are a red thread through the book. Its 3 logoi appearing at intervals and masterfully discussed by Immervar. It's like one of the article that probably set me on this path 20 years ago. That's 8a on the handout. In 2009, I tried to show how the Samian War and Athens' competition with Samos were responsible for the deeper reasons why Herodotus went on long about Samos in chapter 60, as he mentions. It's not just because of these 3 greatest erga that we know. It's more the fact that these things are still the greatest even in his day, i.e. competing with Athens. The book's 2 episodes of what I would call Samian revolts, one sort of depicted as stasis between the leader of a naval arche, that is Polycrates, and his own people, those who are, we could call Sungenes, and the other, Logos, the leader of the Persian arche, crushing the island after attempting to install a leadership friendly to himself. I argued that these are 2 ways of depicting what happened to Samos in the late 440s and from late 441 to 439. Such a view helps explain why the proponent of democracy, Otanes, was responsible for the island's enslavement, because essentially that's what ended up happening. And this is in sort of in the story from 141 to 9. And Aristotle could certainly see analogies between how the Persians dealt with subjects who once held an arche and Athens' treatment of Samos. This is handout 8d, where he uses the story of Periander and Thrasybulus and the cutting off of the high bits of corn, and makes the explicit comparison between the Persians and how they treated the Babylonians and the Medes, with how Athens treated Samos, Lesbos, and Chios. I don't think Aristotle was the first to see this analogy by any stretch of the imagination. And in another context, I would try to demonstrate that there's a 3rd Samian revolt in Book 3, and that's the Babylonian Logos that concludes the book. And there I would bring Aristophanes' Babylonians of 427. Which actually makes allusion to it seems to make an allusion to the treatment of the Samians in the Samian War. Now, Herodotus' treatment of Samos in Book 3 is part of the book's wider agenda, oblique engagement with the period during which Athens transformed from league to empire pervades its pages. This is handout 9. Very useful discussions of this are Meigs's classic 1943 article, but more recently Ralph Laub's 2009 article, Learning from the Enemy, the latter of which documenting the instruments of empire that Athens borrowed from Persia. And the particularly salient moment is, from that period of, roughly 454 to sort of the mid 440s. Now, beyond the military campaigns and ambitions of Athens prefigured in the ostensibly Persian history of Book 3, so in addition to Samos, we've got Egypt and the West, like at 3:136. This is handout 9A and D. The book also brings up topics salient to Athens, such as the inheritance status of Nothoi when discussing Cambyses' identity. And this is Book 3, Chapter 2, handout 9B. Or the fastidious cataloging of Persian tribute, not as Dasmos, but Phoros, and this is 9C. Herodotus consistently uses the term created to refer to contributions to the Delian League for his Eastern empires, and Herodotus identifies the first wrong done to the Greeks being the collection of Phoros from the Ionian Greeks, which is, again, what Croesus is going to do this, Persia is going to do this, and in Herodotus' day, Athens doing this. Darius and Pericles, and this is 9D, is also something that this is work in progress, but I think Darius is characterized in ways that are meant to evoke Pericles. There's all sorts of reasons for this, and I have this on 7B on the handout, but among which prominent might be the positive light in which we find Darius portrayed in Aeschylus's Pericles, whose Choregos was none other than Pericles himself. And I thank Tom for an article of 2005, which suddenly made me realize that this could be how it started for Herodotus. But we can talk more about this. That's clearly a bit that I'm working on. But I'll return to the Antigone. I would argue, and I would argue not entirely alone, that behind the Antigone is also allusion to the Samian War. And this is handout 10. Those of us who maintain this position see the ancient testimony mentioned above in 3A as a most welcome invitation to comment on the obvious parallels between the tragic and historical plots. Two are most prominent. One is the treatment of Polynices and the bodies of the Samian dead, and the second is the outspoken female critic of the strategos who ordered such things. And this is handout 10B. According to Durrus of Samos, preserved by Plutarch, Pericles had the Samian triarchs and marines brought into the marketplace of Miletus and crucified there, and that then, when they had already suffered grievously for 10 days, he gave orders to break their heads in with clubs and make an end of them, and then cast their bodies forth without burial rites, akedeuta ta somata. The strategos ordering the denial of proper burial rites. This is precisely the opening of the play where Creon is called a strategos and his charugma, stressed by a full 11 repetitions of the noun and verb forms of its stem, sort of kind of put that in your face. I'd go further and say that behind Antigone's allusion to Zeus in line 2, when she says, do you know what Zeus, the evils that he's done for us, or I'm paraphrasing very badly, which is broken off, I think is a reference to the well-known parodic depiction of Pericles, and perhaps is even also a nod to the fact that of the decree of Morochides, which gagged comedy's capacity to voice criticism precisely in the period of the war and its aftermath. But that's something to discuss. As Polynices, the Samians were bound with ties of Sunganea with Athenians as part of a league that traded in these shared ties of kinship. They were philoi, even if they found themselves at war with Athens in response to behavior they deemed with some legitimacy as unjustified. As Creon, Pericles is said to have found himself confronted by an outspoken female, criticizing the war he waged against the Sunganese polis. We're told in 10C on the handout that when Pericles, after his subjection of Samos, had returned to Athens, he gave honorable burial to those who had fallen in the war, and for the oration which he made according to custom over their tombs, he won the greatest admiration. But as he came down from the bema, while the rest of the women clasped his hand and fastened wreaths and fillets on his head, as though he were some victorious athlete, Elpeniki drew nigh, and said, "This is admirable in thee, Pericles, and deserving of wreaths, in that thou hast lost us many brave citizens, not in war with Phoenicians or Medes, like my brother Cimon, but in the subversion of an allied and kindred city." This seems to be testimony of Ion because Plutarch mentions it in the next sentence. He mentions Ion for their elaboration. But the anecdote itself, we don't know whether that happened on the day, but it's if it's gossip, if it didn't happen, it's contemporary gossip. It's a contemporary fiction, which is relevant in itself. I would argue that Elpeniki lies behind Sophocles' depiction of Antigone, an identification obvious to contemporaries, given that she too was famous for a philia for her brother in preference to a husband. I mean, a lot of the scurrilous gossip was that she was actually married to him as only a half sister. And it was a philia for her brother that seemed excessive to some. The vitriol of Pericles is sexist dismissal of Elpeniki in Plutarch's stories, quoting Archilochus at her in a very nasty way, both in this passage and also in the earlier episode referred to by Plutarch when she intercedes for Cimon, find easy parallels throughout Antigone, where the majority of Creon's seemingly principled defenses of his actions, where he evokes the language of the polis and who redefines philia at the expense of empathetic ties with kin, they end up concluding with the offense he takes at being challenged by a woman. So almost every grand speech with all the, all the good sentiment of political sort of putting the city first end up with something about women at the end. So here the stress on the political language of our passage of Antigone and Kropp's article defending its internal logic and its place within the context of the play is all the more intelligible if a political situation lies behind the play's plot. I mean, there's a lot more I could say about the relationship of the Antigone to the Samian War. This is one of the reasons why I've avoided this paper so long, because it's really gritty. It takes a lot of work. But one of the ways in which it particularly manifests itself, I think, is in the language of the play. But a lot of researchers, I over the years got this feeling that that one could reconstruct quite a lot of Periclean language despite having very little Pericles. Some of the things that, if I just give you a couple soundings that are striking, is that like the word phronema used in, it appears 6 times in Antigone and only 1 time in the fragments. And when we look at Thucydides, it's 3 out of the 10 times are in Periclean speeches. And just before the part of the funeral oration, which is important for this moment, Pericles invokes the man having phronema, saying that for a man having phronema, more painful is the distress of being a coward than death with strength and a common hope that at the same time comes about unperceived. And this for a man having phronema is quite evocative of Antigone when she says for those thinking, and then kind of gives this somewhat counterintuitive explanation of her behavior, as in the Pericles, where he tries to say that somehow dying is sort of not as bad as actually surviving, which is what he sort of says in that passage. Another interesting thing is like the word nous. There's 24 appearances of that stem, like either noun or adjective or verb in the Antigone, which is like off the charts in Sophocles. And there's in Plutarch, we're told that Anaxagoras was called nous, and there seems to be quite a lot of reference to this stem also in the Periclean speeches and Thucydides, and also prophet in this play. There's it kind of appears 12 times the stem occurred, and Pericles in the bit where he's actually consoling, or not consoling, but sort of offering some kind of consolation to the family of the dead. He talks twice about the kerdos that they where they have like that they had more, like for the older people who can't have more children, it's kerdos for them, that they spent more than half of their life happy. And so there's something going on with these words, but I'm sorry, this is sort of not as worked out, but this requires a lot of hardcore work with TLG and a lot of really careful work, but it feels hot to me. So there are other jarring elements to the play that are also don't really work with the plot quite so well, like talking about voting stones of tyrants in the plural in line 60. evokes sort of language that's more at home with Athenian democracy in terms of the voting stones. And when we're told this is a kerugma of Creon, so then we get to this this idea of a voting stone. And tyrants is, of course, a word that starts getting bandied around about the Athenians. In 1080, there's that line about cities being in turmoil, which is sort of odd. Like, where do they come from? Another interesting thing is Antigone continually talks about herself being in this kind of, she uses a stem metoik for her kind of burial in this cave, which is interesting because the metic status is been persuasively argued to have kind of come about around the time of Pericles' citizenship law, which wouldn't be that far in date from this play. It appears, that stem appears 3 times in the Antigone, but only once in each of 2 other plays. So there's kind of a lot of hot stuff there, which requires a lot of work. But so I'll just bracket that, and if anybody wants to talk about it, that's fine. But I want to bring the discussion back to the question of the intertextuality between Antigone and Herodotus, Book 3. So, after all this, I would argue the Samian War lies behind both texts, and this is handout 11. It's the common referent. Antigone, the wife of Intaphernes, and Elpeniki all stand up to one in possession of Arche, whether it's an empire or it's just the office one has. In Antigone and in the historical plot, a strategos speaking for, in Antigone and in the historical plot, we have a woman who is speaking, this is a bit messy. So there's 2 things going on. We have Antigone sort of, it's complicated because Antigone can do 2 things. One is that she can evoke Elpeniki as the critic of Pericles, and she's the woman who preferred her brother famously, but she can also be speaking for the Sungenes of the Samians who didn't get buried. So there's 2 reference going on in there. And in both cases, they're opposed to a strategos who's denying burial. And in both play and logos, we have the idea of turning on a philos. So in Herodotus's logos and the play, there's the idea of turning on a philos. Darius puts to death Intaphernes, a man instrumental in his rise to power. Creon denies burial to Polynices, so he turns on someone who's kin or a philos to him. So there are different ways they're recounting obliquely Pericles' war or his role in waging war on a Sumakos and Sungenes polis. Those resisting the identification of like these characters with the historical reference might question the need for the indirection of allusion through myth or Persian history. So why do such a thing? But both the Antigone and the stories of Book 3 thematize precisely the difficulties of speaking honestly to those in possession of Arche. So it's part of the dynamic that it goes back to sympodic poetry of speaking to those who know and speaking in einetic terms. So it doesn't have to be problematic at all. We might not like this kind of reading, but there's no evidence that classical and archaic Greeks didn't like it. In fact, it's the opposite. Tragedy comes into the identification of Athens with the Arche of Book 3. Herodotus challenges the Athenians, who are supposed to be so schooled in tragedy, as to their powers of anagnorisis and their ability to recognize something universal in his Persian logos. If they can't recognize about whom they're really reading, they also show, like so many tragic figures, that they don't really know who they themselves are, something like this, which is sort of just in a nutshell what I think is going on. But I'm not really done here though, because the Antigone's lines do need some explaining. And as well as Herodotus, like what the full picture is that lies behind Herodotus's wife of Intaphernes. And in both cases, I would argue the words of these women constitute a response on their own terms, whether we say to those right-minded or to those so minded as Darius, to the ideology belonging to the Periclean funeral oration. and that's handout 12 on the handout. This is something that Bridget Murnahan has written about, and you get Mark Griffith mentions it in his commentary. There's another article by Blake and Tyrell, and many others have commented on this feature of Antigone and Intaphernes' wife stressing the replaceability of certain members of the family, and how that sort of it sort of evokes, or it's similar to Thucydides' funeral oration attributed to Pericles, where we have the replaceability of certain relations as a feature of the consolation that Pericles gives to the people who have lost sons. The idea that sons are replaceable is handout 12a. Yet you who are still of an age to beget children must bear up in the hope of having others in their stead. Not only will that help you to forget those whom you've lost, but will be to the state at once a reinforcement and a security. And he goes on, blah, blah, blah. Implicitly, he doesn't say it explicitly, but implicitly husbands are replaceable. So some of the consolation that Pericles gives, or this Pericles is made to give, to parents actually resonates with widows, even if Pericles only finally deigns at the end to acknowledge women with the set part of the traditional epitaphios logos, where he takes where he's made to take the occasion to attempt to render them invisible and implicitly suppresses their grief. So I'm kind of jammed in two things there. That's not very well written, but if you read some of the consolation that he seems to direct at parents, you can actually see that would also apply for a woman who lost her husband. The implicit thing is, just get married again. But he doesn't actually deign to talk about it. Instead, when he talks about women, it's in a way that sort of is begrudging. If I have to talk about female virtue, then he will. And he sort of, apart from them being better than their natures, the idea that they're doxa, that they should be not, they shouldn't be, the best fame for them is to not be heard of at all. So he says, if it's necessary for me to make some reference to female excellence, however many of you now will be in a state of widowhood, I will indicate it all in a short exhortation. For great is your repute if you're not worse than your nature you possess. Whomever the fame among men spreads least far, whether one of excellence or of censure. I would just throw in Euripides' Suppliant Women here, insofar as it's quite similar to the funeral oration we have in Thucydides, in that grief for one's husband is portrayed as grotesque, really, with the Evadne's sort of killing herself. It's sort of marginalized in the play in contrast to that of mothers. And then at the end, you have the grief of mothers and sons, which closes the play. And there's quite an overlap of intertextuality between that play and the funeral oration as we have it. So I guess the whole theme of how death and war is treated is something that joins the play with the funeral oration, and the way that female grief is treated is something that joins it. And this is points that people have made more eloquently than I have. I wanted to just throw in here, there's a very little appreciated anecdote of Pericles on his deathbed, which really is kind of very usefully unpacked, I think. It's in 12D on the handout. There, Pericles recounts how, when those around him, thinking he was unconscious just before his death, were praising all his achievements, he interrupts and he says that they were omitting his finest and greatest achievement, namely that no one of the citizens ever wore mourning garments because of him. Now, the rhetoric of the passage is kind of amazing, because it sounds like he's saying, I was not the cause of any deaths, which may be considered either a patent lie or a total denial of responsibility, whether for numerous campaigns and ultimately the war, or the war policy that led to so many deaths within the city. But really, it's saying that if anyone wore mourning clothes, it wasn't because of me. I mean, or that's how you can see it. He didn't encourage it or even really tolerate it. After all, sons and husbands are replaceable and personal expression of grief for those of one's philoi who died is made at some way at odds with the collective celebration of the expression of Athens' dunamis, which is the funeral oration. So it's a perfect sort of demonstration as an anecdote of Pericles' rhetoric, in that it sounds one way, but when you start unpacking it, it has a much darker sort of meaning. And but I would argue that Antigone doesn't really just evoke the ideology in Athens attested in Thucydides' Epitaphios Logos, but more specifically, it was a pointed response to another Periclean Epitaphios Logos, the one that was spoken over the Samian War dead. And this is handout 13. It's entirely plausible that the content of the funeral oration Thucydides recounts replicates some of this material, given it allegedly had the same speaker, 13a on the handout. Why shouldn't Pericles recycle good material, for this later oration? But I would go further with good ancient and modern company and say, which is Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Philip Stater, and argue that Pericles did not give a funeral oration in 431 BC. So the recycler isn't Pericles, the recycler is Thucydides. He only actually spoke over the Samian War dead. And I can rehearse Stater's arguments and add a few of my own. First is that sources only ever suggest one oration. I mean, there's a little bit of ambiguity, but there's never a mention of more than one oration anywhere. And if there's only one, then it has to be the Samian oration, which is attested as well as any Periclean utterance through quotation. And there's a famous line of the war dead, the people who died, are sort of like the spring has been taken from the year. I quote Kennedy on the handout and in his edition on Greek rhetoricians, because it kind of upsets me, because he talks about the simile and he says it does not appear in the funeral oration attributed to Pericles and Thucydides 235 to 46. Memory of it may have been otherwise transmitted from the speech on that occasion, or Pericles may have given more than one funeral oration. It's sort of disturbing to sort of and sort of shows how we get into our bubbles to say that Pericles may have given more than one funeral oration when it's actually very well attested that he did give the Samian War oration. That's just, I find a disturbing way in which we can get stuck in our literary boxes and not really think more about historical, like what else is going on, or other sources that are outside of our immediate sort of interest. The second argument is 13b2 on the handout. The funeral oration from book 2 is only ever called Thucydides in all of ancient writing, and any reference to it is entirely absent from Plutarch. He doesn't even deign to go there when he talks about Pericles' rhetoric in chapter 8:5. Third, there are certain elements of Thucydides' Epitaphios Logos that, if they are Periclean, if he did mine some of Pericles' stuff, they would fit well with the Samian War oration. The incitement to reproduce, 13c on the handout, such as recorded in Thucydides, might seem more appropriate to the 7th year of a 30-year peace than the first years of a war in progress, particularly following a reminder that spring has been removed from the year, and steps must be taken if there will be a bumper crop of men ready to fight when the peace expires. Also, the offensive condescension, 13d, in acknowledging grieving women, Pericles is made by Thucydides to say in 431, great will be her kleos, who is least talked of among the men, whether for good or for bad, stands opposed to Antigone's fame and her devotion to her dead brother and the unwritten laws which require her to bury him, stressed in the play. Moreover, I would add, it stands opposed to that of of Euripides' Alcestes, dated to the same year as the Antigone, if one is persuaded by Lewis's arguments. So people often sort of talk about this, whether the intertextuality between the Alcestis passage, where she says that she didn't want to have to replace her husband, and the Antigone, and wonder if Alcestis is alluding to the Antigone because they have an earlier date. But behind both of these passages can be the same, performance of Pericles, where he sort of asserts that these widows, these war widows, should just get new husbands. So what I would argue is that the quality of Antigone's utterance, to which Goethe responds so negatively, its jarring inappropriateness to the occasion, its dialectical calculus, replicates the quality and the content of Pericles' Samian War funeral oration, reflected more or less accurately in some parts of Thucydides' funeral oration. In response to Pericles' denial of grief for sons and husbands, Sophocles found a mythic plot where a woman could be depicted grieving the only male philos a woman could, by Periclean nomos, actually grieve for. She found a loophole. She has a nomos for those of good sense. She can grieve for her brother. And in that plot, Antigone is made to regurgitate the Periclean line that sons and husbands are replaceable in just such a way that shows how vulgar and jarring a calculus that is. Though no doubt the polloi of Athens, high from their victory and the spoils of Samos, probably lapped up that calculus on the day. I mean, if it wasn't their son or husband, then it can sound quite persuasive, I suppose. Moreover, the fact of a historical referent explains the political aspects of her utterance. I would also say, as I already anticipated, forgetting that I wrote about it a few lines later, but I would also say the passage of the Euripides Alcestis, her words, whose intertextuality with Antigone is often noted to the point of calling it illusion, is 438. And it can also be seen as an analogous response to this funeral oration. And there are other some of the shape of the Alcestis is responding to the fact that the decree that sort of puts some restraints on comedy. Anyway, but Alcestis's refusal to replace her husband in face of what Pericles implicitly demanded as patriotic could be, a similar kind of backlash. Now, Pericles' oration, I would argue, struck some listeners as crudely as the words of Creon do to some of the audience, some of us audiences. Handout 15. The masking of personal ambition and animosities, particularly towards women in general, and this woman in particular, in the high-minded language of polis ideology, is something that's sort of conspicuous. But the views of the oligoi, I think, were in some ways immaterial to Pericles. I mean, this was a victory that even the polloi needed some help celebrating. It was a controversial war, as Elpiniki's criticism and the Moricides decree, the peri tu me commodane, seem to attest. And really, perhaps restrictions on comedy did have implications for the way in which tragedy engaged with contemporary politics in these years. But there's good reason to suppose that Pericles' Black Sea campaign was responding to such criticism as Elpiniki's in waging a barbarian war. It also served the purpose of getting out of Athens, which might have been timely once the hangover from Nike sort of struck in. Moreover, it was a war that almost lost Athens her arche, as Thucydides admits, albeit some 7 books later than when he tells the story of it. And to some, any war dead for a war such as this against a Sunganese polis was too many. In composing the speech, I think he would have had to both tread carefully while also appearing strident. I mean, in some ways, I think he trumped it out. And there are some indications of the lengths that Pericles went in this speech. He uses a comparative argument to make 9 months of almost losing the arche look like a short time. We're told that he compared himself to Agamemnon and said that it took Agamemnon 10 years to take a barbarian city, and it's a barbarian city, that should be easy, right? But he in 9 months reduced the foremost and most powerful people of Ionia. So that's one sort of demonstration of the lengths to which this oration went. Another length to which it went was sort of using Protagorean sort of arguments to focalize the human cost by virtually deifying the dead. We're told by Stesimbrotus that in this funeral oration over those who had fallen in the Samian War, he declared that they had become immortal, like gods. The gods themselves, he said, we cannot see, but from the honors which they receive and the blessings which they bestow, we conclude that they are immortal. So it was, he said, with those who had given their lives for their country. I mean, that's quite extreme. So anyway, that's just an example of a very important speech. So I'm sort of ending on a note just to make us think more about the speech. But I guess one might not follow me in all these arguments, and they've certainly not been the best expressed. But if there's only one that I can just get across and have accepted, is that we should stop disregarding the evidence and stop asserting that Sophocles here alluded to Herodotus. By doing that, all we're doing is denying the evidence of the relative chronology of the text. And it's looking at these texts with the most narrow of visors. It's like it's literature in a display case, and it's ignoring the fact that they were created in and for an actual political world. So that's really what I would like to say, or as the minimum. Anyway, thanks.